The meat turned on the fourth day. By then, the sun had baked the high plains into a dustpan, and the air inside Clayton Harper's saddlebag stank like regret. He'd spent 3 days slicing and salting, hanging strips of beef over mesquite coals, thinking he had it figured. He wrapped them in cotton, tied them with waxed string, and rode south, thinking he'd finally get through the cold stretch with something to chew on besides trail dust. But when he opened the sack near Eagle Pass, all he found was a wet gray curl of rot and wasted effort. The taste of it clung to his throat longer than the stench. He threw the whole bundle into a dry wash and didn't speak for the rest of the ride. Clayton wasn't green. He'd worked cattle since he was 16, driven herds through sleet, hail, and rattlesnake country. He could lash a saddle in the dark and shoot steady with a fever. But nothing humbled him like spoiled meat. It felt like a betrayal, not just of his planning, but of the rules he thought he knew. Salt it, dry it, smoke it, done. But Winter didn't care about ranch rules. That night, in the cabin he'd raised with his own hands 3 years back, he sat by the fire and stared at the last of the good cuts, maybe 15 pounds of shoulder and backstrap. If he lost those, it wasn't just about pride anymore. He wouldn't starve, not yet, but food would get real boring real fast, and there was still snow in the forecast. 2 systems were rolling off the mountains. He could feel it in his knees. He needed a new trick, something no one had taught him, something that didn't need constant smoke or fire or perfect sun. Something the cold couldn't ruin and the wind wouldn't steal. And that's when he remembered the old Apache he'd met near Fort Sumner. Thin man with hands like rope and eyes that saw through things. They'd traded jerky for tobacco. But what Clayton remembered most wasn't the trade, it was the way that man had laughed when he saw Clayton's smoke-drying setup. "You think fire's your friend in winter?" the man had said. "Fire rushes. Wind listens. Use the wind." Back then, Clayton thought it was nonsense. Frontier poetry. Now? Now he was wondering if maybe the old man had known something most ranchers didn't. Because the wind was still coming, he could feel it pressing against the chinks in the log wall. But maybe, just maybe, he could use it. He stood, stretched his knees, and took out the last sack of meat. If the storm wanted to take something, it'd have to work harder this time. Because Clayton Harper was about to build something dumb, ugly, wind-facing, and if it worked, nobody would laugh again. Clayton wasn't the type to remember stories in full. Names, places they blurred after enough years, and whiskey. But tricks? Tricks stuck. Especially ones whispered around a fire by someone who didn't care if you listened or not. That old Apache near Fort Sumner had told him something. Strange. Not in a boasting way. More like someone just thinking out loud, waiting to see if the wind carried it somewhere useful. He'd said, "Cold air don't kill meat if you give it space to breathe." Clayton remembered frowning at the phrase. Back then, he thought of preservation as a battle against rot, against moisture, against the 1,000 tiny things waiting to spoil a man's supper. But the old man talked about alignment, not war. Said if you knew how to hang meat in a way the cold can read it, you didn't need heat, just rhythm, just patience. Cut thin, salt hard, let the wind walk through it, the man had said. The mountain don't spoil, it dries. Clayton had scoffed. Smoked jerky was the only way he'd ever known. Even back at the trading post, they said cold air turned meat to leather on the outside, while the inside festered. But now, staring at the ruined sack in the firelight, he wondered if he'd misunderstood the real enemy. Maybe it wasn't the cold. Maybe it was stillness. So he got to work. First, he sharpened his skinning knife and sliced the remaining meat as thin as a deck of playing cards. Not long strips like usual, wide, flat sheets that the wind could press against like canvas on a tent. He didn't just salt the cuts, he massaged the salt in, letting it pull moisture to the surface like sap from a pine. Then he searched the cabin's corner for the thinnest rawhide rope he had left and started tying. He dragged an old corral post out from under the eaves, nailed it between 2 uprights, and strung the rope low about waist height. Then another above that, just chest level. He wasn't building a smoker. He wasn't even building a drying rack by normal standards. It looked more like a sail rig, and that was the point. He angled it to face the wind channel coming down off the ridgeline where the trees bowed with every gust. The cold would be sharp there, relentless. But if the meat could survive, it'd mean one thing: it had learned to breathe with the storm, not against it. By nightfall, 30 pieces of salted beef hung like prayer flags across the ropes, red and glistening, strung like offerings to a god of wind and hunger. Inside, the fire burned low, but Clayton didn't stoke it. He just watched the meat sway and hoped the old Apache hadn't been full of it, because the real storm was still coming. And this time, the fire might not be enough. The next morning came in shades of steel. Cloud cover hung low over the treetops, and the sky held that strange metallic stillness that meant snow was gathering somewhere just out of sight. The kind of quiet that didn't calm it warned, but the wind was still blowing steady, and that was the only thing Clayton needed. He stepped outside, boots crunching through last night's crust, and walked straight to the rack. The meat had changed. Not much, but just enough to notice. The surface had lost its raw sheen. It looked duller, firmer. A fine frost had formed along the grain lines, and when Clayton tapped one slice gently, it moved stiff like hide stretched over a drum. No mold, no rot, just cold progress. He'd tied every strip with 2-point anchors, letting them flutter but not fold. He remembered the old Apache saying something about letting the spirit of the meat stretch. Sounded mystical at the time, but now it just made practical sense. If air could pass through, not just around, it wouldn't trap moisture. That was the trick. Not fire, not even salt. Flow. Clayton adjusted a few of the ties, making sure the edges didn't curl inward. He pressed his thumb into one thick cut and watched frost melt against the heat of his glove. It gave just a little not frozen solid, but not raw either. Somewhere in between. Half alive. He liked that. Inside, the fire was barely lit. He wasn't wasting wood today, not when the wind could work for him for free. So, he built a second rack. This one was shorter, meant for smaller cuts: tongue, kidney, slivers of flank. He strung it low and wide beneath the eaves, where the wind curled back toward the cabin in a sideways drift. A colder current, harsher. But Clayton had a theory. Meat cured in suffering lasted longer. And if that didn't work, well, he'd know soon enough. By mid-afternoon, snow began to fall. Light at first, then steadier. The wind didn't stop it, just changed tone. Softer now, more careful, like it understood something delicate was happening and didn't want to interrupt. Clayton sat beneath the awning and watched the flakes collect on the jerky rack. Any rancher seeing this would have called him mad. Letting good beef sit out in a snowstorm? Insane. Wasteful. But that was the thing most ranchers didn't understand: wind. They fought it, hid from it, built tight barns, and smoked their meat until it tasted like ash. But Clayton remembered the look in the old scout's eyes, how he'd said, "You can't teach the fire not to burn, but you can teach the wind to cure." So Clayton waited, not for smoke to rise, but for silence to settle. And when the snow fell sideways and the ropes began to hum with tension, he didn't flinch. He just watched the wind do its work and dared the storm to try and stop him. The storm came sooner than forecasted, if you could call gut instinct and a creaky knee a forecast. By dusk, the clouds thickened into slate and the wind changed direction, no longer playful but hard, decisive. Snow began to fall in slanted sheets, not gentle flakes, the kind that wanted to bury, not dust. Clayton stepped out into it once more, coat flapping, scarf already stiff with frost. The racks were still holding. The high line danced like a violin string in the gusts, but the knots stayed tight. Meat strips trembled, but didn't fall. He checked each one quickly. Some were already curling at the edges, the flesh darkening to a deep red, almost black in places. That was good. That meant moisture was leaving. That meant the cold was drawing the meat inward, not breaking it apart. He added one more anchoring rope diagonal, tied to a stump buried under snow. His fingers were numb by the time he finished, and he had to stamp his boots twice just to feel his toes again. As he backed away, a gust hit the rack so hard it moaned, the rope straining like a sail on a snapped mast. Inside the cabin, he stoked the fire not for himself, but for the next hour. If something went wrong, he'd need to see clearly, fast. He filled the lanterns, checked the hinges on the front door, and moved his spare tack inside. The blizzard was going to hit, not just pass. By nightfall, the wind was a scream. Trees cracked in the distance. Ice pellets ticked against the shutters like someone flinging gravel. The fire roared inside the stone hearth, but even that heat couldn't keep up with the sucking cold that came down through the chimney throat. Clayton tried to sleep. He lasted maybe 30 minutes. Then he got up, pulled on his boots, and stepped into the white. It was blinding. The air was thick with snow and sound. Like walking through a waterfall made of needles. He couldn't see the racks at first, just shapes. But when he reached them ropes taut, meat still hanging, his chest eased. No tears, no lost pieces. No snow buildup on the flesh itself. The motion of the wind kept it clean. Alive. Moving. Still, he stayed out there for almost an hour, rotating a few pieces, checking tie points. He worked by lantern light, shielding it with his hand so it wouldn't snuff out. Not because he was afraid of the dark, but because this moment, this absurd sight of him tending meat in a blizzard, was proof of something. This wasn't madness. It was method. It was wind-drying in its truest, harshest form. And when the storm tried to shake the rack loose again, it didn't budge. Because Clayton had tied it with more than rope, he'd tied it with stubbornness and a little bit of faith. By the second morning, the storm had blown itself hollow. What was once a snarl of wind and white had gone silent, leaving behind a landscape that looked like it had never been touched by heat. The snowdrifts covered everything but the top rail of the meat rack, poking through like a flagpole on a sunken ship. Clayton stepped outside slow, shovel in one hand, lantern in the other, steam rising from his collar. It was bitter. The kind of cold that didn't just sting at bit. But he didn't feel it. Not yet. He was too focused on one thing, whether the meat had survived. He shoveled carefully, pushing back snow to expose the low rack first. The cuts of flank and kidney looked strange, shrunken, dark, edges curled tight like old paper. But when he pressed one between gloved fingers, it was dry. Not brittle, not rock hard, just leathery, almost like it had learned to protect itself. He cleared the rest of the snow with care and checked the higher rack. Same result. The meat hadn't spoiled. It hadn't frozen solid, either not in the way meat usually does, stiff and useless. Instead, it had dried. The cold hadn't killed it. It had cured it. Clayton remembered something else the Apache had said half a lifetime ago. Snow don't rot. It draws out what ain't ready. Back then it sounded like mysticism. Now it felt like engineering. Nature's version of a dehydrator, no fuel, no flame. Just air, motion, time. He brought one strip inside and laid it by the fire not to cook it, just to thaw it gently. It didn't drip. No water, no blood. Just a faint aroma of salt and survival. He tore off a piece with his teeth. Chewed. It was dense. Clean. Not smoky, but earthy. The kind of taste that stayed in the back of the mouth like coffee grounds or iron. He closed his eyes. It wasn't the best jerky he'd ever had, but it was real, honest, proof of concept. He looked at the rest of the strips hanging out there, still dancing lightly in the post-blizzard breeze. That meat would last now, not just days, weeks, maybe longer. Enough to outlive the second storm that was already building to the west. And all of it had happened without fire. No smokehouse, no iron pan, just rope, salt, and wind. He sat back against the hearthstone, tired but calm. The wind had stopped screaming, but it had spoken. And Clayton had listened. The meat was safe from rot now, but that didn't mean it was safe. The cold had cured it better than any flame could have, but as the wind quieted and the scent began to settle, new problems stirred in the trees. Coyotes. Clayton first heard them 2 nights after the blizzard, low yips and distant howls, scattered at first, then closer. It wasn't panic screaming like wolves. Coyotes had a different sound. Playful, almost. Like they were laughing at something they hadn't eaten yet. At first he thought maybe the snowpack would keep them at bay. Too deep, too cold. But that was wishful thinking. By the time he found the tracks around the lower rack tight circles, paw prints sunken deep, he knew they weren't just passing through. They'd smelled the drying meat. They'd waited for the storm to finish its work, and now they were ready to steal it. That night, Clayton didn't sleep. He pulled a chair to the doorway and sat with his rifle across his lap and a lantern flickering on the sill. The light didn't reach far, but the firelight in his gut did. He wasn't angry, just watchful. The way an animal watches its own den. Around midnight he saw the first one, slender, snow-dusted, yellow eyes gleaming. It stepped into the clearing like it owned it. Then another behind, and another. A pack, quiet, testing the air, ears flicking toward the rack. Clayton didn't shoot, not yet. Instead, he reached for a bag of pine pitch and bark he'd kept near the hearth. He'd been saving it for trade, but it had a better use now. He shoveled coals into a pan, tossed in the bark and resin, and stepped outside. The smoke rose in thick, biting plumes, sweet, sour, bitter, pine smoke, heavy and clinging. He walked in slow circles around the rack, dragging the pan with him. Let the smoke soak the air. Let it sting. Coyotes hated it. The scent, the unpredictability, the sting in their sinuses. They backed off. Not ran, not panicked, just uncomfortable, which was enough. He repeated the trick every night that week. Sometimes they'd return, but they never crossed the smoke ring. During the day, he started weaving boughs of pine and fir into the frame of the rack itself, draping them over the lines, tying bundles with rawhide, not just for camouflage, for scent. He even smeared ash from the stove's backplate into the snow around the posts. Old tricks, campfire alchemy, half myth, half method. But it worked. By the end of the week, the coyotes gave up. The wind had cured the meat, but the smoke had kept it his. And as he stood, in the frozen dark, watching the last of the predators slink back into the tree line, Clayton realized something deeper than pride. Sometimes the trick isn't just what you build. It's how far you'll stay awake to protect it. The sky turned green-gray that afternoon. Not like spring or rain or even a storm, it looked wrong, like the horizon had swallowed a fire and hadn't cooled yet. Clayton knew the signs. The snow crunch changed. The birds vanished. The smoke from his chimney didn't rise, it crawled. And that's when he knew another blizzard was coming, but worse than the last. He checked the racks again. Everything looked solid, meat dry, ropes taut, pine boughs still fragrant. But the knots? Those worried him. The wind had tugged on them all week, and with another storm coming, the risk wasn't spoilage anymore, it was loss. One snap, one fallen rail, and everything he'd built would be buried before dawn. So he went back to something he hadn't used since his cattle drive days, the Apache hitch. It wasn't a normal knot. It twisted back over itself, then locked with a bite loop that cinched tighter under pressure. The kind of knot you used when you were too tired to check it twice but still needed it to hold. The old scout who'd taught it to him had said, "Tie it like you'll never come back. Then maybe you will." Clayton untied every rope on the top rack and retied them all with the hitch. It took hours. The cold numbed his hands, cracked his knuckles open. Blood froze to the rope in flakes. But by dusk, every line could take twice the tension. Every anchor dug deeper into the frame. He reinforced the rack with diagonal braces, scrap wood, an old chair leg, even a busted rake handle lashed between uprights. Not elegant, not pretty, but braced. And when the wind began to pick up again, the whole frame groaned but didn't sway. Then the real storm hit. This time, it wasn't just snow. It was sleet, sharp, slapping, wind-driven sheets of ice. It hammered the meat, the wood, the very air. Clayton watched from inside, lantern dimmed, rifle nearby. He'd built this system from superstition and sweat, and now he could do nothing but trust it. Midnight came. The storm howled. It wasn't even wind anymore, it was a voice. And Clayton swore he heard it say, "You shouldn't have tried this." But when he opened the door at first light, it wasn't loss that met him, it was stillness. The racks were half buried, frosted over, but standing. The ropes had held. The frame had braced. The meat? Cold, tighter, leaner, not ruined, seasoned. The storm had tried to break it. Instead, it had cured it further. Clayton stood there a long time, steam rising from his breath, hat pulled low. The wind had given its final test, and the rack had passed. The sun broke through on the fourth day after the second blizzard. Just a crack of gold between two slate-colored clouds, but it was enough. Enough to cast shadows again. Enough to remind Clayton Harper that the world still had warmth, even if it was stingy with it. He waited until midday, when the wind calmed and the snow began to soften just slightly. Then he stepped out with his hunting knife and a tin plate. The racks stood as they had for nearly 2 weeks now, scarred, iced, weather-worn, but proud. Each strip of meat now looked like something carved from bark, dark, ridged, almost fossilized. He pulled down one of the smaller cuts, a piece of shoulder he'd hung thin and salted heavier than the rest. It cracked as he bent it. Not snapped like frozen meat cracked, the way birch bark splits when it's dry enough to burn without smoke. Back inside, he sat by the hearth, still cool from last night's fire, and held the strip in his hands like a relic. He didn't heat it, didn't soften it, just bit down. It was tough at first, resistant, like it didn't want to yield. Then it gave, and the flavor hit. Salty, gamey, clean, no rot, no sour. Just meat, stripped of everything except what mattered, the taste of survival. He chewed in silence, letting it sit in his mouth longer than usual. This wasn't food. This was proof. 1,000 things could have gone wrong. The knots could have slipped. The wind could have died. The coyotes could have taken it. The blizzard could have buried it. The cold could have sealed it wet instead of dry. But none of that had happened. Because he had paid attention, not just to the meat, but to the air, the tension in the rope, the angle of the snow, the memory of an old Apache's half-muttered lessons. He chewed through another piece, then another. It was ugly jerky, uneven, some parts nearly too hard to bite, others flaked apart like dry tobacco. But every bite was safe. Every chew was a meal that wouldn't kill him. That mattered more than texture. Clayton began sorting through the rest, stacking the driest pieces into a sack lined with canvas, setting aside anything that felt damp or suspicious for another day or two of hanging. There wasn't much waste. Most of it had cured perfectly. Enough to last weeks, maybe more. And not a single stick of firewood had been used to make it happen. The cold, the wind, and a little borrowed wisdom had done what smokehouses couldn't. He leaned back against the hearth, full for the first time in days, and smiled. Because that first bite? It had cracked like bark, but it had tasted like victory. It was near dusk when the rider came. Clayton heard the hooves before he saw the shape slow, dragging, uneven. Not a gallop. Not even a trot, just the plodding rhythm of an animal at the edge of exhaustion. He stepped outside, rifle slung low, hand resting easy on the stock. What he saw wasn't a threat. It was a man frozen at the edges, slumped over the saddle horn, wrapped in a cavalry coat that had lost all its warmth days ago. The rider barely made it to the porch before sliding off the saddle and landing hard in the snow. Clayton dragged him inside, didn't ask questions, just stripped off the ice-caked layers, stoked the fire, and poured hot water over a handful of dried meat shavings into a tin cup. The man's face was wind-burned raw, lips cracked, eyes sunken. But when he smelled the broth, if you could call it that, he came back to life just enough to sip. He didn't speak for 10 minutes, just drank. Slowly, eyes closed. Then he looked around the cabin, at the ropes, the pine boughs, the dark, paper-thin strips of meat laid across stone, at the long, low rack outside that hadn't fallen, not even in a double blizzard. "You smoke it all?" he rasped. Clayton shook his head. Wind-dried, the scout blinked. "You mean air-cured?" Clayton nodded. The man looked back at the plate, touched the meat, turned it over in his hands like it might disappear. "This saved me," he said flatly. "Did 3 days through sleet with nothing but crackers and melted snow. Thought I was going to pass, out somewhere between here and Del Norte." Clayton offered him another strip. The man took it, bit in, chewed thoughtfully. Then he chuckled. "This is wild," he said. "No smoke? No rot?" "No fire at all," Clayton said. "Just rope, salt, wind. A trick someone once told me, and a whole lot of time to test it." The scout leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. You know what the boys back in the outpost would call this? Clayton raised an eyebrow. Genius, the man said. Absolute frontier genius. Clayton didn't smile. He didn't need to. Praise from soldiers meant something, sure, but what mattered more was the look in the scout's eyes, a mix of gratitude and disbelief. The look of someone who'd nearly died and knew exactly how close he'd come and what had pulled him back. The meat wasn't just food now. It was a map, a blueprint, a thing to share. Before the scout rode out the next morning, he sketched the racks, wrote down the knot, patterns, asked Clayton to show him exactly how the boughs were arranged, said he'd pass it along, to his men, to anyone who listened. And as Clayton watched him disappear into the snow trail, he felt something rise in his chest, not pride, just peace. Because one man's crazy had just become someone else's lifeline. Spring came slow that year. The kind of spring that crept instead of bloomed ice, melting a little deeper into the soil each day, not because it was ready, but because it had no choice. The snow retreated in ragged patches, revealing the bones of trees, wagon ruts half lost under drifts, and racks of jerky still standing like skeletons of a storm long gone. By then the story had already moved. Not in headlines, not in telegrams, but in whispers, campfire to campfire, bunkhouse to bunkhouse. The tale of a cowboy who didn't use fire, who didn't run to the smokehouse, who stared down 2 blizzards and hung meat like prayer flags in the wind. They called it strange. Some still called it stupid. But more and more were trying it, because it worked. And you couldn't argue with survival. Clayton never called it a method, never gave it a name. When folks showed up in the weeks that followed, travelers, soldiers, even a few ranchers who used to laugh at him, he just showed them the racks, showed them the ropes. How to tie low, how to cut thin, how to face the wind. How the pine smoke wasn't for flavor, but for defense. How the knots weren't for tension, they were for trust. He didn't explain the philosophy behind it. Didn't wax poetic about nature, or balance, or the poetry of winter. He just pointed to the meat, now stacked in canvas sacks under the hearth, still good months later. This is what fed me, he'd say, and that was enough. By summer, one of the scouts sent word from Fort Garland. A detachment of soldiers had survived an unexpected freeze using what they called the Harper hanging. No one knew exactly what it meant, just that you cut the meat wide, salted it hard, and let the mountain wind walk through it. Clayton didn't flinch at the name. He didn't need the credit. He just liked the idea that something born out of desperation, something every other man would have called insane, had turned into shared knowledge. The wind, after all, had always known what it was doing. It just needed one man stubborn enough to listen. The last rack he built wasn't for meat. It was smaller, made from cedar, strung tighter, with pine boughs braided all along the crossbeams. He didn't dry food on it. He just kept it standing tall behind the cabin where the storms used to hit hardest. Not as a monument, but as a reminder that even the coldest blizzard can't rot what's built with patience, salt, and a little bit of faith in things most folks ignore, like wind.